of Paul that Jesus reappeared to his disciples, and that this forms the bedrock of Paul's emerging faith. Naturally, the Gospels, which would be written later by followers of Paul, would want to prove that Jesus actually physically rose from the dead. And they have taken the story further. And so we see one stage in Mark, we see a further development in Matthew, a further development in Luke, and then the final development in John's Gospel. And a further development in Mel Gibson's movie. So there are improvements along the line. What Mel Gibson has done is nothing new. This is what the gospel writers have done too. They have told the story the way they thought it should have been told. And Mel Gibson has done that. We need to see Jesus sitting there. We need to see Jim Caviezel back alive without any stripes on his body, just the one little nail wound in his palm, where it shouldn't be anyhow. So Gibson has told it the way it ought to be told. Each gospel writer in his own time has told it the way he thought it ought to be told. Given this evolution of the Gospels, peeling back to the earliest strata of tradition, can you be satisfied in the earliest strata of tradition Jesus actually died on the cross and that he reappeared to his disciples in a physical bodily form? Offer evidence of that.
I have. It's the early oral traditions and Paul himself. You mentioned the Gospels, but again, I'd like to express I'm willing to grant you the Gospels have legend and errors and all kinds of problems for tonight's debate. But I'm still on this other hill, and I'm waiting for you over here. Now, you had mentioned about... No, I'm not going to ask you a question. I'm sorry. You said that no...
You can't just wait and let him ask the question.
Okay. I'll wait for that. No statement that Jesus died in the earliest strata. Well, yes, there is. I mean, in that creed that was within 5 years, and James Dunn, in his new book, Jesus Remembered, said that the tradition in this creed dates back to within months of the crucifixion. Months. And the creed says that he died, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day. And then you go down a couple of verses later. What's really interesting is Paul says in verse 1, I'm going to preach to you the gospel. And then he gives the creed in verses 3 through 8. And then in 9 he says, hey, whether it's me or they, the apostles, the disciples, we preach Jesus and him crucified. In other words, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up, forgive me. He says, we're preaching about the resurrection of Jesus. So there Paul's saying he's preaching the same thing as the disciples are. You go down a few more verses, I think it's verse 14, and he calls this kerygma. In other words, he's identifying it as the formal and official preaching of the disciples. So, I mean, this is very early tradition. And then we have Paul again. He mentions resurrection or dead and raised 30 times in his writings. And then you've also got the creed in Romans chapter 1, verse 3 and 4 that talks about declared the Son of God with power by his resurrection from the dead. So resurrection is in the earliest strata. There is nothing earlier. We can go trace it back to the disciples themselves. So you could say that they're mistaken, perhaps, or, I'll let you raise the theory there. But they interpreted their experiences as being resurrection, which means they understood Jesus of dying. They understood that the body that died was the body that was raised and appeared to them. And so therefore the tomb was empty.
Yes, I can see that you feel that I'm not really dealing with your points, but in fact, if you listen carefully, I have been dealing with your points all of the time, because look, you have said fact number one that Jesus died on the cross, and I'm saying the earliest strata of tradition cannot convince you that Jesus actually died on the cross. Now it's for you to respond to this, but let me lay them all out. First, notice in Mark's gospel that Pilate has a doubt that Jesus actually died, and for good reason, because crucifixion usually took several days to kill a person, and in Mark's gospel, Jesus was only on the cross for a few hours. And all of the beatings that are there in Gibson's movie are just imagination, because Mark does not give you any of those details. It is true that some such beating could have been possible for a crucified victim in the Roman world, but notice also that Pilate was sympathetic towards Jesus. He found him innocent and sought to release him, but he was pressured into agreeing to have Jesus crucified beyond his will. And I think Mel Gibson had it right when he showed the difficulty that Pilate was in there, and he was caught between a rock and a hard place. He finally agreed to have Jesus crucified, but giving that reticence from Pilate it is possible that his men would not have delivered to Jesus the most brutal punishment possible, and that finally Jesus might not have died on the cross. The one thing that might have killed him would have been the spear wound. But that is mentioned only in the Gospel according to John. That is the last of the 4 Gospels, remember, and that represents the last strata of evolution among the Gospels. And if that spear wound was delivered, you would be sure that all of the Gospel writers would mention it because it's such a pertinent fact that would finally prove that Jesus died, or at least give strong evidence for that case, and they do not mention it. The scholars think today that this is an imaginative detail added by John's Gospel in order to prove against the Docetists that Jesus was actually flesh and blood, because we have here the blood and water proving that he is actually real flesh and blood. He's not here as a spirit on the cross, as some Docetists believe. And so we have, within the early strata, no firm evidence that Jesus actually died on the cross. So I've dealt with the fact number 1. About the empty tomb. Now historians...
I'm sorry, can I get a moment to respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yes. You're still dealing with the Gospels. And I'm appealing to this very early evidence, which predates it by decades.
But see, I've answered that. I've shown that this earliest evidence, first of all, the sources are not known. If you cite James Dunn as saying that this was early, that's James Dunn's guess. I respect him as a great scholar, and I read his writings, but after all, it is a scholarly guess from one individual. Somebody else may have a different guess. And that,
just
that
name me
charisma,
any scholars
yes?
just name me any New Testament historians. Okay, and as you know, in New Testament historians, it's largely critical. Many non-Christians, many non-believers, many atheists are in that discipline. Just name me a single New Testament scholar who doubts the death of Jesus.
Notice that I have acknowledged previously that all historians, you can include New Testament scholars, except for Muslims, would agree that Jesus died on the cross, because it is an assumption that somebody who lived 2,000 years ago and is no longer alive is dead.
But that's not why New Testament scholars are concluding that.
Well, they are concluding that for the same reason as everyone else, that Jesus died on the cross, not because they have any irrefutable proof. And I'm not using irrefutable in the ridiculous sense in which you've treated it. You see, you have firm evidence that Jesus was on the cross and died on the cross. You've said so yourself. Everyone agrees on that. Now, do you have firm evidence that he resurrected from the dead? If someone claims that he resurrected from the dead, then we'd be wondering, did you really see him? And did he really die after all? So it is in the light of the later claim that I'm asking, did he really die on the cross? Show me the evidence that he actually died on the cross. What fatal wound killed him on the cross?
Okay.
And I've named Raymond Brown, who has gone through a long discussion on this, and finally, he cannot conclude what would have killed him. Of course, if you took him down and you buried him under 6 feet of dirt, he would have died, but that's not what happened to him. So what really killed Jesus? You said yourself, the medical doctors could not agree on what was the cause of death. So if we don't know the cause of death, the only thing we can say is that a man who lived 2,000 years ago and is no longer with us is dead. And I think that's a universal conclusion. But if you say he reappeared to his disciples, then we should go back and look to see whether he was actually dead. And we cannot find the evidence that he was actually dead, can we?
Okay, now, I think we can. Everybody attests to it. Our understanding of crucifixion militates against it, and medically, the doctors are saying he died. But I do want to comment on Brown, because you mentioned about the spear wound in Brown, and that's correct. John does mention it. But John's the only one who mentions nails for crucifixion. It's not even in a crucifixion scene. He mentions that to Thomas, you see the nail wounds. He's the only one that mentions the crucifragium, or the breaking of legs. The others didn't do that either, but we don't deny that nails were used in crucifixion or that legs weren't broken. Let me give you a quote by Raymond Brown, since you like to use him. This is in Death of the Messiah, the same book that you quoted from, page 1092 and 93. People who would never bother reading a responsible analysis of the traditions about how Jesus was crucified, died, was buried, and rose from the dead are fascinated by the report of some new insight to the effect he was not crucified or did not die. And on page 1373 says, except for the romantic few who think that Jesus did not die on the cross, most scholars accept the uniform testimony of the Gospels that Jesus died during the Judean prefecture of Pontius Pilate. So again, you brought up the Gospels, and I'm on this other hill, and Raymond Brown is with me.
Not really. Not really, because if you read Raymond Brown carefully from the page that you quoted, and I've read it myself as well, that's from the section in which he's dealing with fanciful, imaginative scenarios, whereas, for example, the Ahmadiyyas have claimed that Jesus walked all the way to Kashmir and he died and buried there. Or recently there was an Australian lady, Fearing, who claimed that Jesus came back and he was still alive and he got married to Mary Magdalene.
Right.
Brown was responding to this kind of imaginative detail. But Brown himself, in the section, if you've read it, dealing with the physiological cause of Christ's death, gives a different picture. In the end, he looks at the kinds of medical examinations that have been done now post-mortem, thousands of years after the fact, and he dismisses them because he says that the details that are given by the gospel writers should not be taken as actual physical details that occurred, but they are due to a number of factors, including imaginative detail added by the evangelists themselves. And you mentioned some of them. Yes, they're only in the gospel according to John. Not to deny that nails were used in crucifixion, but to say that Jesus was actually nailed to the cross, this is something that the gospel writers wrote because they thought that is how you tell about a crucifixion. But crucifixion did not necessarily involve nailing. One could have been tied as well. And notice that Gibson, in order to have the nail go in the palm, which is traditionally how it is shown, had to also have the arms tied. And notice that the other two who were condemned to be crucified, they had their arms tied to the crossbar. And it was possible to raise a person to the cross and have his arms tied, and he did not have to be nailed. So maybe Jesus was nailed. But to say that he was necessarily nailed because John says so is really to give us more to imagine. About the breaking of the legs. Again, this is doubted by historical scholars because they look at John putting this in place, and they say that John has written this in order to prove the Old Testament scripture to be true. You see, John has done what Gibson has done. What they have done is that they look at and they say, what should have happened to Jesus if we read the Old Testament right? So Gibson reads in the Old Testament that the Son of God will bruise the head of the serpent. And what does he do? He brings the serpent into the Garden of Gethsemane, so Jesus crushes the head of the serpent. Where is that in the Gospels? Gibson has put that in the movie because he thinks that is how it should have been because it was prophesied. In a similar way, scholars have found that the four gospel writers have written things into the gospels about Jesus, not because this was physically witnessed in the life of Jesus, but because this is how the writers read the Old Testament. They thought this should have happened to Jesus, and so they wrote it. So John thought that there has to be some way in which there is an attempt, people's legs are being broken, but not Jesus's, because it was written, his legs shall not be broken. Even though that was written about the Paschal Lamb, it's something entirely different. They will look on the one whom he has pierced. Even though that is about false prophets who were pierced because they were false prophets, John brings that here about Jesus, even though Jesus is not a false prophet, and that passage had nothing to do with Jesus. But John adds these details, not because they actually physically, historically were witnessed in the life of, or around the death of Jesus, but because John thought that this should have happened because the Old Testament said so, and he wrote it as though it happened, and the Old Testament confirmed it.
Okay.
I notice it's my turn, so how about if I just continue with that? Is that okay?
Well, let's take a break and a breath for a moment. I'm not sure if we're debating Mel Gibson or Brown or what here. I would like to encourage us to maybe take a step back and go at this from another direction. Consider that.
Of water, perhaps?
Take a sip of water. Yeah. I've heard several of the points about 3 times, and my hunch is we're not going anywhere after you hear it 3 times. Okay. You've got the next 15 minutes, and then Shabir, you have 15 minutes after that, and then we'll be going to the audience for some questions, about a half hour, if you'd care to be thinking now what you would like to raise as a question. We'll go from there.
Okay.
Mike.
A few thoughts on the crucifixion. Can I say that?
If you like.
Okay.
Whatever.
You mentioned how we can't be certain nails were used. Well, in a very good book by Martin Hengel, an eminent New Testament scholar, titled Crucifixion, he lists 13 sources in antiquity where nails are used, and Josephus can be added to that list for number 14. We can probably add Tacitus to it as well as 15.
Don't mind if I interrupt you, but I didn't deny that nails were generally used in crucifixions, but I'm asserting that nails were not necessarily used in every crucifixion. A crucified victim might also be tied instead of being nailed.
Okay. Hengel does mention one account in antiquity where binding, tying to the cross is used, but only that it was used and as a practice in Egypt. So we really just don't have any historical kind of evidence whatsoever to show that binding was used by the Romans. Everything seems to point to nails, and so we have no reason to